1915. The American Indians accepted defeat and were confined to reservations. They were pushed towards a marginal status in the richest country of the world. Through the railway, the conquest of the West came to an end. The frontier no longer existed. Confident of itself and its future, the United States was aware of every possibility. The industrial and financial empires appeared suddenly from nowhere, out of one idea, one invention. A Rockefeller was able to say, "God gave me my money." Through the cinema, an art young as the USA herself, she was able to forge her own myths. The light and space of California offered the ideal conditions for the film shoots of that time, and the industry installed itself in a Los Angeles suburb which would become famous as Hollywood. There, D.W. Griffith began work on The Birth of a Nation, a legendary film for the legend of America. The epilogue saw America united under the watchful eye of Christ. In the same year, and in the same climate, two dancers founded a school in the image of America, the Denishawn School. Isadora Duncan and Ruth St. Denis were of the same generation. Both questioned their art as they did life. Tradition was wiped out. Duncan, who was more violently opposed to the classical tradition, was inspired by natural movements. Ruth St. Denis was of a more mystical temperament and found her inspiration in religious emotion. She said, "Dance reveals the soul." Audiences liked her esoteric dances, and she enjoyed great popular acclaim. Her husband, Ted Shawn, was an athlete. He himself was a symbol of all America, personifying the faith of the pioneer and the strength of the frontiersman. Later, he directed a company of young gymnasts, and with them tried to break the taboos hampering the growth of male dance. At the Denishawn, the culture was eclectic. Everything that concerned the stage and performance was taught, not only music, traditional dances, and ballet, but also dramatic gesture based on the Des Arts system, and there were workshops in jewelry, dressmaking, and lighting. Ted Shawn summarized the philosophy of the school in these words: "It was the whole of human movement which was the subject of our research, and not solely the occidental body." In 1917, the whole school took part in the production in nearby studios of Griffith's film Intolerance. In the same year, the States broke its long-standing isolationist stance enshrined in the Monroe Doctrine and threw itself into the First World War. The cinema and its stars contributed to the war effort by encouraging their army, who had left to liberate the old world. Ted Shawn left on national service. Ruth St. Denis and her pupils worked as nurses. The following year, the school was running normally once again. Among the pupils were two young women who had become the two pillars of modern dance, Martha Graham and Doris Humphrey. Martha Graham enrolled at Denishawn after having seen a performance by Ruth St. Denis. Like her, Graham wanted to make a religion out of her dance. She performed in the works of Ruth St. Denis and later in those of Ted Shawn. With the help of her music teacher, Louis Horst, she choreographed her first solos while still heavily influenced by the exotic. Later, she discovered the beauty of Native American Indian gesture and the spiritual intensity of their dances. While Graham's dances remained visceral, Doris Humphrey possessed a more aesthetic vision. Before arriving at Denishawn, Humphrey had already experienced the free dance which followed in the wake of Duncan. In her first solos, the field of study she devoted her life to was made clear: the exploration of a space in which the dancer risks losing balance. Ruth St. Denis and Ted Shawn took the company on a tour to the Far East, which was to last for more than 2 years. Doris Humphrey was fascinated by the Asian dances and by the authenticity of their art. On the other hand, the formalized exoticism of the Denishawn began to irritate her. She said, "I'm neither Indian nor Javanese, but American, and I want to dance what is appropriate for me." This was her promise of a new dance. She left the Denishawn. Along with Charles Weidman, another dancer from the school, she moved to New York, a city open to risk-taking, where she would find her own direction. At that time, modern dance and the theater were elitist. The truly popular art form remained the cinema, and it was there that most of the imagination and talent found its expression. In 1923, Martha Graham also left California for New York, where she had a contract with a musical comedy revue, Greenwich Village Follies. In her repertoire were the works Serenata Morisca, which Ted Shawn had choreographed for her, and Moonlight Kisses. 2 years later, Graham left the Follies to create her own works. In 1928, Humphrey formed her own company, the Humphrey Weidman Dance Company. A movement from Bach's Suite in D gave the title to her first important choreographic work, a composition for 5 dancers. It was still permeated with the spirit of the Denishawn. However, the transformation was immediately apparent. Through the slow and fluid displacement of the dancers, the space seemed to emanate from their bodies, as if it was the dance itself which generated it. In the 30s, New York became the capital of dance. It was the golden age of black dance and music. Jazz and tap dance took over the nightclubs. The most famous of these was the Cotton Club. It was also a legendary period for modern dance. New schools, foundations and theatres were opened, and a specialized press and audience emerged. Modern dance and the German expressionist dance found success at the same time. Both rejected whatever already existed and sought their own identity. New York couldn't have remained indifferent to German expressionism because it was passed on through Hanya Holm, a pupil of Mary Wiegmann. However, the real success was reserved for modern dance and its founders, Doris Humphrey and Martha Graham. Then, more than at any other time, modern dance belonged to women. Graham wanted to uncover the human soul. Of her own body, she claimed, the century and its events had passed through. She was directing a company of women and a school. She was a figurehead of the avant-garde and a leading light of American culture. She said, "Like the modernist painters and architects, we stripped our form of expression of any decorative or superfluous element." She developed a technique based on breath. Breathing in and breathing out correspond to the double principles of contraction and release. For the first time, a new grammar of movement appeared, complete with its own syntax, which was not that of classical ballet. The works which date from that period are equally impregnated with social idealism and with the belief in a new way of life. In 1927, the year of large-scale protests in Union Square against the executions of Sacco and Vanzetti, Graham created Revolt. And a little later, in the middle of the Depression and unemployment, Steps in the Street. In 1936, she refused to participate in the Berlin Olympics, and the civil war in Spain inspired a tragic piece. It was always the personal destiny of each individual which interested her, the internal reflection of the external drama. Doris Humphrey also formulated her own technique. Her basic principle was that for every fall there is a recovery, and movement develops between two forms of imbalance. Movement, she said, is an arc between two deaths. Like Graham, she found inspiration in the social idealism of the age. However, for Humphrey, the idea was only a pretext. Movement itself was always paramount. For her, what was essential was always expressed through pure dance. Starting in 1936, Doris Humphrey, Martha Graham, Charles Weidman, Hanya Holm, and the principal modern dancers met each summer at Bennington College. There they gave classes and made performances. American colleges played a vital role in the development of modern dance. They offered dance a space to experiment, impossible to find on the circuit of commercial venues. At Bennington College in 1938, Martha Graham introduced the first male dancer into her company, Eric Hawkins. He quickly became her company soloist, and then her husband. It was there that José Limón was discovered, a dancer later trained by Doris Humphrey. Both Limón and Hawkins first became interested in dance after seeing, in a performance by the German expressionist Harold Kreutzberg, his ability to express himself completely through movement. Limón would add a nobility and a masculine strength to the gentleness of Humphrey's movement. The Moor's Pavane was choreographed by Limón after Shakespeare's Othello. Limón was more sensitive than Humphrey to the social concerns of the times. He believed in the artist as spokesman for the moral conscience of the age. The artist Edward Hopper revealed another image of America through his remarkable canvases. Doris Humphrey, plagued by arthritis, was forced to stop dancing. Martha Graham began the second phase of her career. She distanced herself from social issues and became more involved with psychoanalysis. In Errand into the Maze, the story of Theseus is reinterpreted as that of a man lost in the labyrinths of the unconscious. She performed the roles of many mythological figures: Herodias, Medea, Clytemnestra, and Jocasta. Jocasta she danced when she was over 60 years old. In her own way, Graham was asking the question Freud asked: what does woman want? In the 40s, New York was a nursery for the artists escaping Europe. Yves Tanguy, André Breton, Max Ernst, Chagall, and Mondrian joined Denishawn, a renegade of the First World War. All the movements of contemporary art were represented at the Museum of Modern Art: Expressionism, Cubism, and above all, Surrealism. Peggy Guggenheim had just opened her gallery, Art of the Century, which welcomed European artists of the avant-garde. Some young American painters assimilated all these styles. All were greatly influenced by the works of Masson. He had opened up a new expressive field through the body of the unconscious. Also important were the works of Picasso, particularly Guernica. Jackson Pollock was in the forefront of these painters who hurled their emotions onto the canvas, using spots, blotches, marks, and lines. There was no central figure, but a multiplicity of dots and strong lines crossing the canvas from one end to the other. The space of the work was no longer confined by the frame. They became known as the abstract expressionists. American dance also became more abstract. A pupil of Hanya Holm, Olwyn Nicolai, took the social and psychological content out of expressionism. The body became one element among many in the theater.
I didn't want to tell the little boy-girl stories and the sexual stories that were prevalent before the war, the Hitler War, and immediately afterwards. This was very boring at that time for me. And then, because I no longer was concerned with realism, I had begun to become an abstractionist. I sort of revolted from the way the theaters were used, because since the time of the late Greek theater until now, realism was the thing. So I tore lights down from